So the whole work of communicative language teaching assumes that your students will perform communicative tasks. They will engage in communication as authentically as possible in your scenario, um, to show what they have learned, that they will actually test them out in as authentic as possible scenarios, and that will be how they see how well they're doing and also how you evaluate how well they're doing, as opposed to an inauthentic assessment like a multiple choice test, or even sometimes having students do tasks orally where they just perform grammatical functions or just answer contrived questions that are designed to test their ability to put certain types of grammatical functions into use, or assessments where they mark what's the right answer, what's the wrong answer, or they fill in the blank. All of these don't involve performing actual real live communication. And while it may not be possible to throw them into an authentic situation like sending them to a store where the employees only speak your language, that might not be possible, but it is possible to ask them to perform something very similar, that is set up to work in as authentic a way as possible, and then to judge their ability to perform in that way. And the reason that we assess that way is because the assessment itself is good practice for the learner. We're not wasting their time. They benefit from that actual practice of putting into motion what they have learned, as well as it gives us a much better picture, and it gives the learner a better picture of themselves in terms of how ready are they to use this language in a real situation, not just what book knowledge do they have about this, what facts can they repeat or apply, which errors can they recognize, but when it comes down to it, when they are going to use the language, what can they realistically do? And of course, we want to practice in communicative situations so that it's not the first time that they're put on the spot, because of course then their nerves will be jittery and the effective filter will go up and they will perform much lower than they're actually capable of. What we need to do is we need to practice all the time in our classes communicating with one another, so that when we have them do it for an assessment, whether that be formative or summative, they're accustomed to performing that way and we get a realistic picture of how ready they are to do so in a real life situation, which is the ultimate goal. Languages are alive when we really use them in real situations for real purposes, when there's an authentic need for them. So we design the assessments to have that need, and then we assess how well the learner is doing, and hopefully the learner also gets a chance to assess how ready they are for those real life situations. So this is why the emphasis is on performance assessments and not knowledge checks or sort of right wrong assessments like multiple choice or like filling in the blank, because that doesn't tell us whether they can use the language in real life, which is all that we really care about. So I only do performance assessments. I don't use any what I call traditional colonial assessments, where it's a knowledge check, it's a quiz, there's multiple choice, or they fill in the blank. I don't do that at all. I don't feel that it's a good use of my learners' time. And the act of doing it doesn't necessarily help them to improve in their language. It's essentially wasted time for them where they're just doing something for me. Now, I'll have folks do that when it's content learning, of course, because content learning can actually process a little bit better that way, right and wrong, true and false. That makes sense for learning facts and information, just like you have in this course. Is this the definition of that? Is this the optimal practice, etc.? But in terms of language usage, we really need to stick to, I'm in a situation, something happens, and I use the language to respond, or I have a need and I use the language to express it, and then something happens and I use the language to respond. We essentially want to test or assess the way we actually want the outcomes to be in the real life situations. And that's where our whole design of communicative language teaching as uh, as encapsulated in project-based learning is the wise approach. because they are always doing things that we really want them to be able to do. They are always doing real life things. Yes, we have to contrive to a certain amount because our learning situations are very often divorced from real life, and we're trying to make up for that. Yes, we have to plan carefully. Yes, we have to limit the scope of what they learn and what they're assessed on, because learners can only handle so much at a time. And we're trying to keep the group mostly in the same neighborhood, not exactly on the same page, but in the same neighborhood. So yes, we make those adjustments. Yes, we artificialize a bit, but we really want performance to be something that's familiar and comfortable for them, that they've done many times, so that when they go out into their life, they feel that confidence. We talked about the key role that confidence plays in revitalization. People don't speak languages voluntarily if they don't feel confident in them. So we want them to feel confident using it in the situation, so that when they encounter a situation where they could have used their dominant language, they would choose to use the target language because they feel confident enough doing so. They've tried it before. They basically know how it's going to go. They understand their own level and their own capabilities, and they're familiar with the pressures of an interaction, a communicative act of some kind, where it matters how well they are understood and how well they understand. So that's why we do performance assessments. You don't have to do them exclusively, but you should definitely do them predominantly. They should definitely be the vast majority of what happens for students in your courses. And we also are going to look at rubrics and feedback. And the way you design the rubrics and the feedback can help if you're in a situation where you're being required to assess at a certain frequency or in a certain way, or there are sort of traditional colonial expectations on you. It's relatively easy to transform performance assessments into something that looks like a traditional colonial assessment, so that it can be accepted by people who think that way. But you should start out by really understanding how it's going to work and making sure that you're creating the best student experience that you possibly can. So we're going to look at 3 examples. I think examples are the best way to understand what a performance assessment is and how it works, how it benefits the learner, rather than a sort of scientific dissection. I think these examples will be enough for you to imagine your own examples and maybe to tweak what you've been already doing. So I want first to look at a video of an assessment that I did. I'll just give you a tiny clip of it, that I do in the Lifejacket course, which is a course I can teach you how to teach. It's for the total beginners, those who have no language skills whatsoever. And it's very intensive, and it's very tightly sequenced and scaffolded. You may have already seen some examples of it. It is designed to help them participate in a classroom where there's group work, where there's research, where there's hands-on activities, where they are problem solving, a project-based classroom, a project-based language learning classroom. It prepares them to participate and to be able to stay in the immersion environment. So they know how to ask questions, they know how to understand basic instructions, give instructions, cooperate in a group, all in the target language because of the Lifejacket course. So here's an example. This is a formative assessment that I do. You could certainly give a little more preparation time and a little more structure and turn this into a summative assessment, but this is a performance assessment that I do. So I'll show you a video of a certain instance when we did this. So hopefully this will show. And I will make this full screen. And let me just make sure that you are hearing this sound. Should be good. So this is an example of a performance assessment where I've asked them to take a little cartoon and tell a story. This is on, I believe, day. This is on day 9. So they have had 9 hours of instruction in the language at this point. Before those 9 hours, they had never heard of the language before. They didn't know anything about it. They started with 0 context and 0 vocabulary or grammatical understanding. 9 hours in, they're able to take a cartoon and tell a story. So they had their choice of cartoons. I gave them a document with lots of different cartoons, And so this student, Ani, she chose this cartoon, and now she's going to tell the story about it that she has prepared. So she's going to perform telling a story. This is a very short, very accessible version of storytelling, which is extremely important in Dakota culture. So even though that's presentational language, it's not necessarily a conversational back and forth. Of course, presentational language has a value, and it has a lot of value in the Dakota context because storytelling is really, really, really key in Dakota culture. So it's integrated from the very beginning. So this is Ani telling her story, and she will be given feedback afterwards. So just have a look at how it works.
Angetutunde wia jante washte. Ichinj wistodia ohnar stanipi okihi. Upan wia pejuta sabakchi wistodia ohnar stani. Ukan wia shkata.
Shkate.
Ichinj shkata pi washte dake.
Nina washe. Wow. Hey, Nina, hey, Chitu. Huh?
So this is an example of, so that was an example where she had time to prep, she knew what her prompt was, and she knew that she was expected to engage in this culturally relevant activity of telling a story. You saw that I jumped in at one point because she was asking for help, and she's a total beginner. So this is only 9 hours into her exposure to the language period. She was able to do some really amazing things. She was able to use appropriate discourse markers. So she said, and then there's this, and then there's this, and there's this. So she wove her words together in a good way. She also was able to put together really complex sentences. So if you don't speak Dakota, one of the sentences that she put together was, the woman works on her computer with the coffee. She used correct word order, which is very different from any language that she speaks. She speaks Armenian, English, and French. Very different word order. So actually she said, the woman with her coffee on her computer works. And she put that together very nicely. It was very clear pronunciation. And she did a good job of preparing to speak and then speaking without doing a lot of ooh, which is not really looked on well in Dakota culture. And so that had been modeled for them, and she had absorbed that. So she did a few things where she responded to the prompt. She was very clear. She spoke in a natural way, like clearly she prepared herself, but she spoke in a natural way. I did not feel that she was reading it. And she incorporated some cultural knowledge that she had, both linguistic cultural knowledge, so that discourse organization, how she put her thoughts together was culturally appropriate, as well as the way she delivered the information was culturally appropriate. Of course, we built on that a lot after 9 hours, but that's something that the Lifejacket course gets her to very quickly. And so she performed something that she knew what it was, she'd seen it done before, and she had practiced doing it in small pieces, and then she did it one all together. So that was built up to over time, and that's how a good performance assessment should be, that they've seen it done before, they know what it should sound like, look like, they understand the cultural aspects of how they're going to be evaluated, and they also are able to prepare themselves for what they would like to do, even if they don't necessarily read. We don't necessarily want it to be scripted, but they're prepared. They kind of know what's going to happen, and then they do it. So we really get to see the best of their language, hear the best of their language, and in that case, her flow and her grammar and her pronunciation were all excellent. And she's a very shy student who really hangs back. So each student did some version of that. That's an example of a performance assessment. And another example that I'll give is from a content-based course. So Lifejacket is a language-focused course where they learn a minimum of information or cultural content, a little bit, but just enough to participate appropriately in the classroom. In content-based courses, so this is an example from a French course that I taught, they are really learning a lot of new information as well. They're learning about the world. In this case, they were learning about different countries, so French-speaking countries, and they were putting together a policy proposal, a proposition. So they were proposing a new policy, and what they looked at were, and these are also, could consider these to be advanced beginners or intermediate low, but they're a low proficiency group who have had some instruction before, but they are not considered to be like what we would consider intermediate mid. They're considered lower than that. And so this student also is originally Spanish speaking, also speaks English, and then engaged in this in an immersive course in French, and learned about several countries in Africa and South America where there are controversies regarding environmental policies, colonial powers, and indigenous people. So essentially there are corporations who want to use environmental resources. Either they want to mine or build pipelines or pan for gold. And the colonial powers in general are allowing that or facilitating that or in some way. And then there are indigenous people who in general are opposed to that and feel that it's harmful to them and to the environment. And so you have a really complex set of issues where you have the environmental side, you have the political side, and the different levels of governmental power, as well as you have the post-colonial or neo-colonial relationship between indigenous people and European powers, in this case, France. And you have, of course, the issue of public interest and corporate or private business interest. So that's a lot of content for the student to learn, and he learned about it in multiple countries. And then he had to choose a country or context, and he had to develop a policy proposal. So this is a huge amount of content learning. He's encouraged to make sure that his proposal introduces a new plan, suggests something that isn't already being tried because there's a sort of a stalemate in the controversy, and that it could potentially spell out the role of each party and potentially could appeal to each party. So it doesn't have to be a perfect compromise, but the advantages to each party are supposed to be stated. And they're supposed to be backed up. Each part of the plan is supposed to be backed up with some type of evidence, some type of proof. So it's a little bit like a one-sided debate where the student, again, it's presentational speaking, and they explain what their proposal is and why it's a good idea, and why they give the selling points of their proposal. So I don't actually have permission to use video from that particular course. As a few of my courses, I don't have permission to share the videos. So I won't share the actual video of the student performing this, but he gave about a 15 to 20 minute proposal. Again, he's a sort of an advanced beginner in French. So to some extent, his background in Spanish helps him, but he actually has to do a lot of thinking and organization of his thoughts that have really nothing to do with that. And of course, the limited French that he has. At this point, we had worked together intensively for 3 weeks, and he was able to do this very well. And so this shows his completed rubric. So you see how I designed the rubric for, this is for something that took longer. When Annie prepped her story, she prepped it overnight from one course meeting to the next. This was prepped, we worked on it together. It was a project over the course of a week, and this was the summative assessment. So I have a rubric for any summative assessment. The one you saw before was a formative assessment. So I didn't have a formal rubric. I gave verbal and nonverbal feedback on what was good and what could use some work. Here we have the formal rubric for this summative assessment. You see that I have given different different levels of excellence, as well as different categories that the student should be addressing. And then I filled it out by putting a circle around where I thought the student fell. And then I gave overall comments. And so I gave some comments on clarity. I always give comments on what's clear, what could be clearer. I gave some comments on the structure, how the thoughts were put together. In this case, there was something missing that we had asked for. And then I also gave a general overall comment on what was really done well. So here you have 4 levels, and each level is described, and I'll read you the levels. So the first is I explain the causes and consequences of the event. So you're talking about a controversy where there's a conflict over environmental policy. What are the causes of the environmental controversy, and what are its consequences? They do environmental, social, and economic consequences, and then they talk about the legal status of the event itself. I proposed changes and new ideas. So they weren't allowed, I limited what they could do in order to challenge them linguistically. They weren't allowed to say, I agree with the government and the government should continue its policies. It's a stalemate, it's a controversy, so they had to propose a new policy to some extent. I defend my proposal with evidence. So they had to use facts that they had gathered over the week that we worked together on these issues in order to support their arguments. They couldn't just make a ridiculous proposal, which I've seen students do. They had to really back it up, which meant that they had to really understand the source material that we use. We used only authentic materials here. So they used articles, they used videos, they used podcasts, all of them authentic, either from France or from the country in question. And they had to draw from those in their own original way. So I supported them in understanding, but they put the ideas together themselves. My proposal respects human rights. So they were limited under international law. We had looked at policies of the UN, and their proposal had to align with United Nations law and the Declaration of Human Rights. They weren't allowed to say, for example, well, we'll just kill off all the indigenous people. Nope, they had to propose something that respected their rights. And we spent some time learning what those were, and they were surprised. For example, indigenous people have the rights to maintain their language. They have the right to access their ancestral homelands. They have the right to their traditional hunting and fishing and gathering practices. So those were surprising to them, and they had to develop a proposal that respected those. So that's stated both specifically human rights as well as international law. So things like they can't violate national boundaries, they can't engage in an unauthorized act of war, etc. We talked about those. And then I used visual aids to support my proposal. So there was something else that they had to do. And then, of course, they learned how to talk about their visual aid, how to talk about presenting on Zoom. All that vocabulary also got practiced. So you see that I've given level 4 very clear and very well informed. For most of the items, very clear and very well informed. For one item, which was supporting with evidence, I said it's mostly clear and mostly well informed. So there were some claims that didn't come with evidence, and I felt like they might be disprovable. So I just said that most of them are clear and most of them are well informed. And for the level 2, there was actually a lack of new ideas. There was a change proposed, but it was a change that had already been proposed. And so I gave a level 2 on that, which is less than satisfactory, but it doesn't say that it's completely missing. So it was there, but it just wasn't quite satisfactory. So I said, it's not very clear or it's not very well informed. So each is described, and then they get more information from the overall comment. So that's an example of a content-based language performance assessment. And their peers also gave them feedback immediately after they presented on Zoom, and then they got this from me at the end of the course session. This was a culturally sustaining example. So this is an example of a new type of rubric that I'm working with, where we actually use the target culture, in this case, Dakota, to set expectations of the student as they perform the linguistic task. So in this case, they do a fashion show. They create visuals like online paper dolls or just visuals of people wearing clothing. They can use photos if they want. And then they talk about the clothing that the person is wearing and why they're wearing that. And this is for total beginners. This goes into daily routines, what time of day, where are they going to go, what are they going to eat, drink, are they going to a powwow, are they dancing, are they going to work? They use all that language that they have learned to talk about their person. And then it's a conversation in this case. So they also have to ask their partner questions. Where is this person going? Are they going to work? What are they going to eat? What is their mood? Why are they wearing this? And then they also have to use the language to give feedback on the clothing that the person picked out. So this is very beautiful. I don't really like that. I think that that will be difficult in, this weather. They're going to use all that language after they've had a sort of a level 1 beginner's course. And so we designed this in a nonlinear fashion to represent a departure from colonial thought. So this works in more of a circle. And there's parts to the circle. So the top of the circle are elements that are evaluated by the teacher. The teacher speaks to why fashion, clothing choice is culturally relevant. It does play an important role in Dakota culture, and there's lots of meaning to lots of different types of clothing. So this is very relevant to the culture. An example of something that wouldn't be relevant to the culture would be something like the students engage in a conversation about trading Bitcoin. Not that Dakota people can't do that, but that's not really grounded in Dakota culture. So it wouldn't be considered to be a culturally sustaining task. A Dakota epistemology, so this means ways of knowing. So the teacher should analyze the way in which this is built on ways of knowing. So ways of knowing could include things like the clothing that we wear, sometimes having a spirit. The clothing that we wear signifying who we are in society, meaning like whether we're married or not married, whether we're a parent or not. Also, Dakota ways of knowing, very important if you've taken your clothing from animals in some way. What does that mean? How are you in relationship with that animal? How you take the clothing? So all of that is really important. And so the teacher has taught about that a little bit, has explained a little bit about that. The students might not have all the language to talk in complete depth about clothing and how it relates to the animals or plants it was taken from, etc. But they understand that that exists and that the importance of clothing, the significance of clothing is part of Dakota ways of knowing. So it's looked at in that way, as opposed to we might think of a Western or white or Washichu way of knowing as, for example, how much things cost, what designer designed them, whether they were shown on a runway at in a certain season, things having seasonality, matching up with trends. That's a different way of knowing about clothing. So this is meant to be approached, and the students have been prepared to approach this in somewhat more of a Dakota way of knowing, epistemology. Also situational appropriateness. So in this case, this calls in things like the person's membership in the community. For example, if there are white students in the classroom or non-Indigenous students in the classroom, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to talk about wearing, otter tails and otter skins in their hair, or having elk teeth, unless those were gifted to them by an Indigenous person. So they would talk about a different type of clothing, as well as, of course, there's certain gender taboos. So there's certain things that men wouldn't talk about and certain things that women wouldn't talk about, certain things that Two-Spirit people would talk about. So it really depends on who you are and where you are. And of course, talking about wearing, for example, your regalia, particular types of regalia to the grocery store, for example, would not be situationally appropriate. So all of that should be baked into what the students have learned and understand about the task, and the students should be able to then engage appropriately. And of course, between the 3 modes of communication, this is going to be interpersonal, because this is going to be a conversation back and forth, asking questions, finding out information, and then giving feedback on what one has learned. There are some specific Dakota values, cultural values. Of course, this is always open to interpretation. Everyone's different, but we've selected some from a published PDF by an organization called Dakota Wichoha, Dakota Way of Life. They've identified some widely held values of the Dakota culture, and so we've chosen some that apply to this task, and we've put them into the rubric. Also, the students get to talk about what they chose or what they controlled. What about their interest was involved in this task. And then they are able to give themselves feedback, give feedback to their peer who they're conversing with, as well as get feedback from the teacher. So there's sort of a 360, or what you might think of as an 8-directional way of processing where one is at in this. This is a summative at the end of a fashion unit, a summative assessment. So sort of an 8-directional view of where you are at in your cultural and linguistic knowledge. And then, of course, clarity is the biggest part of the rubric, how clear you were, whether we understood you, whether you understood the people who were talking to you, but mostly in the production is really important. And these 2 mark circles here, they symbolize a response discussion, which is culturally appropriate when someone gives a presentation or talks about something. Then it's appropriate for the teacher to respond to what they've said, not just in a critiquing way, but in an authentic way. Like, for example, oh, you shared that you have an eagle feather in your regalia. So that has meaning. So then they might tell their own story, or they might ask a story about eagle feathers or talk about the protocols around eagle feathers. So they're responding to the content. They're not just, it's not a fake conversation where you say a bunch of things and then the teacher says, good job, check. They actually talk to you as a person, which is of course much more culturally authentic than just standing back and judging you, and then it's just over and we pretend like you didn't say any of that stuff, you didn't share any of that with us. You're actually sharing with us. We're actually in a relationship. It's not evaluative, but it is a response. It is an acknowledgement of what you've shared. And then finally, of course, there may be corrections and improvements, and the student can take notes of those. So the teacher can say, for example, you're pronouncing this word the wrong way, or this should be conjugated this way, and then the student can note that going forward. And so this is what that actually looks like on a really easy to fill out rubric. It's going back to the straight lines, but it's much quicker. So there are numerical values assigned, and they translate to this will be good, meaning it's not good now, but you'll get good at it. This translates to, the first one translates to this will be done. So you didn't do it now, but you will do it. You'll learn how to do it. The second one is this will be good. And the third one is this is good. And that's also culturally embedded in a way that Dakota people don't tend to say, this was incredible, this was amazing, this was, this exceeded all expectations. That's not really how people respond to things. So these are much more, they're supportive and they're positive, but they're also more in line with the way that people authentically communicate. And of course, you can have a numerical value, but you can also have a comment. So that you can either note how this happened, you did this, I saw you mention that. That's really good practice. The student really feels seen, and it helps the teacher also keep good records of what happened. And then of course it can also be something like, next time try to remember this. It can be advice. And of course it might be blank, but it's generally really helpful to the student to give as many comments as are reasonable with the time and the effort and the number of students that you have. And you see here that we've translated that into an overall comment and an overall grade, which aligns it with the colonial type of testing. So we can say this student got 23 out of 27 on their summative exam, and that is understandable in that way of thinking. Even though that's not a Dakota way of thinking, it helps us to translate it. So we've just kind of put some numbers to those in a way that's not too far from the culture. So the task is culturally sustaining in that it both allows students an occasion to learn things about culture with regard to clothes. It's also culturally sustaining in the sense that students get to express themselves. They get to share their version of clothing, and that is considered legitimate. Whatever they share that's situationally appropriate is validated, is accepted as an assessment of their language skills. That's their content knowledge. And so that's really validating of whatever their personal culture is. And people can have differences across families, individuals. Someone might come in with some goth outfit or something, and that's fine. It's culturally sustaining because what they know and love in their lived experience is being brought into the classroom, validated and mined for the knowledge that it contains. And then it's culturally sustaining because the way that it's evaluated is informed by the culture and tries as much as possible to stay in line with the values and the norms of communication that are actually part of the target language culture, so that it's not just completely divorced. Students might also take a multiple choice exam, for example, that is completely divorced from the culture. So these are 3 examples of performance assessments. I hope it's given you some ideas and you can try to design some of your own.